So I don't know if you've heard, but apparently there's an election that's happening in a couple of months' time. It's like no one's talking about it, but so I thought I'd just let you know about it. Of course, everyone is talking about it. It feels impossible to escape right now. Conversations about what's happening, polls, everything seems to be about an election that's happening in a couple months' time. And it's not just that it's everywhere, it feels like it's deeply important to people. Perhaps you know of families who have been pulled apart by who each person's voting for, so they can barely even speak to each other. I know of churches where people have left the church because they feel like one particular candidate was not spoken of enough or was spoken of too much. I know of situations where people claim that if you are not voting for one of these particular candidates, then you are probably not even a Christian. It matters a lot to people, and it's worth asking why. And I suspect at least part of it is a sense of powerlessness as we feel just the weight of the stuff going on in the world. We follow the news about the economy and things going on in the world, and we ask, what can I do? Or we find ourselves weighed down by an awareness of, I guess what you could call moral failure within our society, whether we're talking about racism or sexual abuse or death of the unborn, and we say, what can I do? Or even this week, think two different situations of a shooting. One very close to us, a train in River Forest, 4 people, innocent, just being shot. And then more recently, of course, we hear the story in Georgia of another school shooting done by a teenage boy. And we ask, what can I do? And we feel powerless. And so I think sometimes when we feel powerless, we just try to gravitate towards where we see power. It seems like the only solution isn't power. Where it turns us towards is politics. But of course, that's empty, right? I mean, and I'm not trying to denigrate voting, but statistically, you and I, our votes will make zero difference, right? I mean, even in a swing state, it's rarely decided by fewer than 1,000 votes, and we're not in a swing state. But even if somehow through the political process, through the active work of persuading and leading people, we were able to somehow change the candidate that was elected into office, do we really think that that candidate will solve all of the problems that I just identified? It's not that the political process is unimportant. It's not that voting is unimportant. But when we're asking, what can I do? We're asking for something bigger than that, right? But still, what can we do? I want to suggest this morning that God's Word actually tells us that there is something significant and meaningful that you and I can do in response to what we're seeing in this world. That there is actually a way that we can channel our energy in a way that is substantial and that makes a difference. This morning, I want to return to a passage we've looked at a few years ago, Ephesians 4. We're spending a couple weeks kind of preparing for where we're going to go with our sermon series. We'll return to Romans in a couple weeks' time. But this morning, I want to look at Ephesians 4, and I would like to provoke you to consider that one of the single best ways that you can seek to bring good to this world is by working to make this church more beautiful. Now, to understand why I would say that, we need to recognize that Jesus actually has a plan, has a solution for the world's problems that is greater than any other political solution out there. And I want to just try to give us a picture of this plan by kind of moving through 3 steps that we see in Ephesians, 3 pieces to understanding Jesus' plan. And the first one, and if you don't have your bulletins open, I invite you to have them open because we're going to be looking really just at the second half of the passage that was read, starting in verse 10. And in verse 10, we see a description of Jesus as the one who descended, that is, as the one who became one of us, who died, and who ascended, that is, the one who rose again and is now seated at God's right hand, victorious. So those two words capture what Jesus did in this world, but what we also see in verse 10 is a purpose. It says, he is the one who descended, is the one who ascended far above all the heavens, that he might fill all things. That is why Jesus came. That is why he died. That is why he rose again. That is his plan to bring salvation to the world. He is going to fill this world. Which might feel a little abstract. What does that mean for him to fill all things? Well, imagine one of you were to right now go downstairs and come to children's church, and whoever's the leader is probably doing a great job, but you see these kids active and moving and excited, and you'd say, these kids are full of energy. What does that mean, that they're full of energy? It means that they're so kind of overflowing with energy that it's affecting everything about what they're doing. They're full of it. And there's something similar about what we're saying when the world is full of Jesus. The idea is that in every aspect, every way, who Jesus is, his rule, his salvation, his leadership is affecting every aspect of this world. That's what it means when we're told that Jesus came to fill the world. Because that is the only thing actually sufficient for the world's problems. I mean, you and I know this, that the world is not just a little bit out of joint. It's not just a little bit off so that kind of a new leader or a technological breakthrough or policy will suddenly make everything right. No, our world is terminally ill. Society is blind in such a way that we have lost the way and we have no idea how to go where we're going. We're broken and disordered. We are kind of condemned to futility. And no policy will fix that. We need something more. But if you study the Gospels, you know that Jesus is the one who's able to heal the dying. For the blind, he is able to give sight. When someone whose life is fundamentally disordered, who's demon-possessed, comes to Jesus with a word, Jesus is able to make that person whole. He brings the prodigal child home as he finds the tax collector, Matthew, and he says, "Come and follow me." Because the reason that we have the problems with this world is, as a society, we have tried to do something that we were never, ever, ever meant to do. We're trying to live apart from God. We're trying to live without him. And that is the heart of our problem. And that is why Jesus is the one who's able to bring the solution. Because when Jesus comes, every miracle that he did, every sign that he did was pointing to this deeper reality that he is the one who has come to reconnect people back to God. He is the one who brings forgiveness, who deals with guilt. He is the one who brings the lost back into the family of God. He is the one who restores those who are in futility and brings them to worship. He is the only solution to the problems that this world has. And so when he has died and risen again, he has come to fill the world so that the winter will become spring, so that what is withered will suddenly come back to life, so that what was broken and sad will be filled with joy as it is made whole. Jesus has come so that when the world is full, no one will ever worry about whether they have food tomorrow. When the world is full of Jesus, the most vulnerable person in the world will also be the most secure. When the world is full of Jesus, swords will be turned into plowshares, and guns will be melted down and made into playgrounds. That is the solution. Jesus has come to fill this world. Now, that part of the plan, perhaps, is something that we're familiar with. Maybe we've never used the language of Jesus filling the world, but if you've been a part of this church or any church, you've probably heard before that the solution to the world's problems is found in Jesus. But it's the second piece of this plan that I think might catch some of us off guard. And that is, in the time between Jesus' ascension and his coming again, the way that Jesus is choosing to fill this world is through the church. So again, if we look at our passage, after verse 10, where we see what I've just said about his intent to fill all things, where does it go right after that? It starts speaking of how Jesus is giving gifts to the church so that the church can do what the church is supposed to do. Do you see that connection? It's not the first time we see this in Ephesians. In Ephesians chapter 1, when Paul is praying for Christians that they might have a vision of what God is doing, he ultimately speaks of how God rose Jesus from the dead and gave him a position of power, and talked about how Jesus is the head of the church. And the church is his body, and it says the church is his fullness, the fullness of the one who fills all things. We are the fullness of Jesus. What does that mean? Well, put more simply, we are the way that Jesus fills this world. It is through the church, it's through congregations like ours that Jesus comes to be known, that his love comes to be experienced, that his rule comes to change people. It is through the church, through congregations like ours, that Jesus fills the world and makes things right. Which I realize seems improbable, counterintuitive. But I would suggest that is largely because the church isn't doing its job. That's largely because the church has lost its way and we've forgotten that our fundamental calling is quite simply to grow up. And that brings to the third part of this plan. See, we just talked about how Jesus is equipping the church in verses 11 and 12, but it tells us where the goal is, what he is doing to try to bring about in the church, and that goal is described in verse 13. The goal is for the church to become mature. Do you see verse 13? All these things until what? We attain the unity of the faith, the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood. And that's contrasted in verse 14, so that we may no longer be children. Jesus is working in the church to help us to grow up to become an adult. And the way that adulthood is described is that when we become mature, we attain to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Do you see that? The idea is that as we grow, as we become what we're meant to be, we become more and more filled with Jesus. And as we become more and more like Jesus, then Jesus becomes more and more present in the world around us. Jesus fills the world through the church as Jesus first fills his church and enables us to be mature. Now, importantly, notice when it's talking about maturity here, it's not just talking about individuals. That's oftentimes how we read these verses. We think that he's talking about individuals growing up, that each of us are baby Christians and then we become adult Christians as we grow. And that's true, but that's actually not what he's talking about here. He's talking about a community that's growing up. He's saying that communities can be immature and communities can be mature. And what Jesus is seeking to do amongst each church community is to make us into mature communities that resemble Christ. So a mature community is described in verse 13, where it talks about the unity of the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God. So a mature community has unity. And not only does it have unity, but it is rooted in this knowledge of the faith, rooted in this knowledge of Christ, anchored in stability. That's what maturity looks like. On the other hand, immaturity looks the opposite of this. So rather than united, it's described as children in the plural. It's not united. Rather than rooted and stable, we have this image of an immature community as one that is tossed to and fro by every wave of teaching. Whenever some new idea comes, they follow that for a little while, and then another new idea comes and they follow that. And it's just back and forth, and all sorts of different people with all sorts of different opinions. And because of this immaturity, notice it says there's a vulnerability that con men, those who deceive, can come and take people captive by their lives. That's how an immature community looks. And when you think about what is described here, well, it seems pretty clear that if we think about our society right now, we are living in an immature society, right? We are clearly not unified. And what's more, we seem to be passed, thrown back and forth like on the waves of an ocean by every new idea. It's dizzying. 2 years ago, what people were saying is now different from what's going to be in 2 years hence. And what's the problem? Is the problem with whiteness, or is the problem with wokeness? The changing in the way that we speak of identity and gender and sexuality and trends and all of those things, it just keeps on moving, and there's a new idea, and there's just no semblance of any wisdom or thoughtfulness or depth. And 5 years from now, it's going to be something else altogether. And what does that mean? It means that we see this incredible vulnerability where people are being conned, taken captive by whether it's false posts of news or some con game. We are immature and vulnerable. And you might say that's true about society, but isn't that basically what is true of the church right now? I mean, doesn't it seem like the church is just pulled apart from controversy all over the place and being held captive to the things of the time? I know of churches that have exploded in size because they stop preaching Jesus and they start preaching politics. Some churches that are far to the right, some churches progressive to the left, those that are trying to make sure that they are affirming to cater to the desires, those that are trying to counteract in that, and it's just to and fro, held captive. Is that any better? Well, no. But the problem is, many churches are stuck in kind of permanent adolescence. And what we're told is there is a better way. There's a different path. There's a path that Jesus seeks to work in each and every church, that he seeks to work in us, a pathway of maturity where we become like Christ. Look again at this description in verse 13. What does it look like to be a mature community? It is a community that is unified in the faith. The faith is here another word for the gospel. In other words, it's a community with a shared story. A shared understanding of where we have come from, of a world that is broken, and our own failure. A shared story of an understanding that our God is a remarkable God of love and grace who has rescued us through Jesus. It's a shared story where, as we're looking forward, there's a hope, there is a happily ever after, there is a beautiful ending that defines where we are right now. It is a shared story that actually forms us in such a way that brings about humility and hopefulness and grace. That's what a mature unity looks like. But what's more, it's not just a unity in the faith, but also notice it's unity of the knowledge of the Son of God. And knowledge here is not just knowledge about, it's not just facts, it's knowing Jesus, knowing him personally. It is a community that has come to know their King and has come to recognize his love and has come to learn how to listen to him as he leads them. And in this, they find unity. Now, when that happens, when the basis of unity is not political or ethnic, but you have people from every politics, every ethnicity, every socioeconomic group, somehow being brought together because they have this shared story and the shared allegiance to the King, there is a depth and a stability that protects from just whatever the faddish idea of the moment is. See, When you have come to know the true King of the universe, and you've come to understand that your destiny is a glorious kingdom, then whatever political figure or political idea of the moment just seems small and insignificant in comparison. And when that happens, when a community more and more takes on that, then they become more and more like Jesus. And through them, the world experiences Jesus more. And do you know how powerful that can be? Let me just speak personally for a moment. I have now been a pastor here 15 years, which is crazy to me because I'm still so young. No, I mean, it just seems strange that I've been here for such a long time. And as I've reflected about just kind of my relationship with Trinity, I mean, you guys received me and welcomed me before you knew me. I've been through difficult times like all of us have, and in discipleship groups and community groups and relationships, when those have happened, people have been with me and prayed for me, and I've experienced love. And when I've messed up, which of course I have, I've experienced from you forgiveness. And let me tell you, over these 15 years, Jesus now is realer to me than he has been before. I know him more because of this community. I am more inspired to want to be like him and follow him because he is more present to me because of what he is doing among us. And as I look around, I have a strong suspicion that I am not the only one for whom this story is true. And more than that, when I look around, I also suspect that it extends beyond that. That as some of you have sought to show kindness to a neighbor in need, or as maybe some of you have sought to reach out to the new kid who feels like he has no friends, or as some of you have sought to live with integrity in a difficult situation in work, in those moments, in that very small but real way, Jesus has become more real and more present to people in this world. Do you see how it works? Do you see this plan? As we grow up and become mature and are made full of Jesus, Jesus becomes more present in us. As Jesus becomes more present in this church, he becomes more present in this world. And as Jesus becomes more present in the world's greatest needs are met through him. That is his plan. And it's now finally that we get to the point where I'm able to return to what I said at the very beginning, that there is a way that you and I can meaningfully address when we see the problems of this world. There is something significant and powerful that you and I actually can do. And that is that you and I, each of us, can work together to build this church into the maturity that it so needs. One final time, look with me at this passage. So verses 13 and 14 hold out the goal, as we just said, but then verses 15 and 16 describe how that goal is attained. And while in verse 16 it's clear that it's ultimately Jesus that makes it happen. He is the body he is the head from whom the body grows. But notice also it says, this growth takes place when each part is working properly. Each part of the body. That's talking about you. That's talking about me. It's saying when you and I, each of us, it doesn't matter who we are. You could be someone who's new to this church, or you can be a pastor. You can be someone who's 9, or you can be 90. You can be single, you can be married. If you are a part of this congregation, then it says you are crucial to this growth process as each of us, in our own God-given distinct way, contributes. That is how we grow together into the maturity. Specifically, we were told in the previous verse that this happens where it says, speaking the truth in love, we grow. And that could be translated just as easily, making the truth known as we love. That is, it's not only about speaking, it's about more than that. And it can look so many different ways. If you are a children's church teacher and you make a real effort to know the names of your kids, so that later on, after children's church, when you see them during the during the time of refreshments, and you greet them by name, they now know that the person who is telling them about Jesus loves them like Jesus. And in this moment, you are making the truth known in your love. If in your community group you know that someone is going through a difficult time, and in the middle of the week you just text them to reach out, ask them how they're doing, and to let them know that you're praying for them in that moment, by caring, you're helping a person who sometimes might feel like no one sees what they're going through to experience not just your love, but realizing God sees them in that moment. And so you are making the truth known as you love. If you and another person find at a certain point in the conversation you start butting heads because you have these two strong opinions, maybe it's about politics, and it kind of doesn't go so well, but then you reach out later saying, hey, I'm not happy with how that went, let's talk together, and you seek to hear each other and find kind of a connection as a result, in that moment, you are making the truth known by how you love. You are showing that there is a unity that is deeper than what divides you. Or when someone wrongs you, and later on they come to you and name it, and you, though it is painful, show forgiveness, in that moment you are making the truth known in love, and they are experiencing in some real tangible way the gracious forgiveness that comes through Jesus. Each of these feels small. Each of these may be even microscopic, but do you see, when each of us are doing this in so many different ways, what happens? There is a sense that all of us together begin to see Jesus more clearly. All of us together are changed by him. We grow in unity and knowledge of Christ and of the faith, and collectively, Jesus becomes more present in us and also through us. And this is how we make a difference. It is as we work together on this project that we seek to change the difficulties, that we seek to bring healing to this world. Now I wonder, does that seem maybe too small to you? How does remembering a kid in children's church's name stop that person from shooting those kids in Georgia? And of course, the answer is it doesn't. But it does mean that the kids growing up in this church are known as they grow up and know that they have a place within this community. How does me sitting over coffee with someone in this church, talking through our differences, deal with the enormous political division in our country? And of course, on one hand it doesn't, but we can be a church where we move beyond this partisan debates and experience something more important, and that's significant. See, the problem is love doesn't scale. You know what I mean by that? It's not like you can have some massive national program. We're going to be a love country. You can't have a policy that will somehow implement love. That's not how love works. Love doesn't scale, but love does grow. I mean, what does Jesus say? Jesus says, my kingdom seems impossibly small. It's like a mustard seed. But it is a seed that one day will become a plant far bigger than you possibly can imagine. My kingdom is like leaven. It's like yeast. The process happens invisibly. It doesn't seem like anything is going on. But as it works through the dough, it changes everything. What if we are a church that truly continues to grow in Christ-likeness, and not just us, but hundreds, maybe thousands of churches do this with us throughout the country, seeking to be countercultural, seeking to grow in a unity that is about knowing Jesus and following him, a unity in the faith? What if that happens? Well, then now we're talking about thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of kids who have a place, a location where they know they belong, maybe kids who otherwise would have fallen through the cracks. Now we're talking about thousands, maybe even millions, finding that there is something more significant, more hopeful, more meaningful than whatever they might do in November when they're voting, that there is something that gives them more hope. What will Jesus do? What would he do if church after church like ours grows up into the maturity that we are called to experience? I don't know. But I know that it's something. I know that it is significant. I know that Jesus is powerfully at work in his church as we take hold of him. He is doing something meaningful. And as we are filled with him, he is filling the world. And I cannot imagine anything more hopeful than that. I invite you to join with me in responding, as we always do, to God's word in prayer. As God has spoken to us, as he has called us through his word, an appropriate response is to begin with confession, is naming our need of him, naming our failure, and to move from that also to ask God for help, knowing that Jesus is the one who empowers us to do what he calls us to do. And in a few minutes' time, I will lead us in prayer. Would you please join with me in silent prayer?